Welcome back to OZK 150, and our topic for today is diversity in the Ozarks. And before we get there, we're going to take a look at our usual famous Ozarker and see if anybody can guess this one. So any guesses? In terms of Ozarks history, it was a long time ago. In terms of natural history, not so long ago. 1800s. 1800s, yeah. Pictures from the 1800s. He was an author. No, not an author. A musician. Not a musician. Politician. He was a politician.
We're narrowing it down.
Is that Marmaduke?
That's not. It's not Marmaduke. It's not. He actually wasn't a politician in Missouri, though he's probably more famous today for his progeny. He had a very famous son. This guy was famous and extremely wealthy in his own right, but his son became even more famous and even wealthier. This is George Hearst, father of William Randolph Hearst. Some of you have heard of William Randolph Hearst, the great media mogul of the early 20th century. George Hearst was born and raised on a farm in the Sullivan, Missouri area. Now, Sullivan, we know, is in the extreme northeastern part of the Ozarks. It's in that kind of border area where, depending on who you talk to, they may or may not claim to be in the Ozarks. But Sullivan is up there just off of I-44. If you drive to St. Louis, you'll see a Sullivan exit, at least one Sullivan exit. But when he was about 29 years old in 1850, Hearst, like thousands of people from Missouri and like thousands of people from the Ozarks, made his way to California. Gold had been discovered. And by the time the Civil War started, a little over a decade later, he had become very wealthy. He and a couple of partners had discovered a big silver mine, and he had made money in other ventures as well. And after the Civil War, he became even wealthier. Eventually, he became one of the best-known prospectors on the West Coast, one of the most trusted prospectors, someone who just seemed to have a knack for finding gold or silver or whatever it was that he was looking for out there, and made what today would translate into millions and millions of dollars. He ended up owning a newspaper in San Francisco, which is where he had a house, and his son, William Randolph Hearst, took over the newspaper when he was in his 20s and eventually built this into just a huge media conglomerate. At the height of William Randolph Hearst's power, he owned about 30 large daily newspapers in the biggest cities around the country, and magazines and all kinds of other stuff, and was just one of the wealthiest people in the world in the early 20th century. And it all started with George Hearst from Missouri. Wasn't he involved with the film stars too and stuff? Yeah, William Randolph Hearst, not George Hearst, but yeah, William Randolph Hearst built. I don't think he ever finished Hearst Castle, and he. And it's open, isn't it, for people to? I guess it is. I'm not sure. I've never been to it, but yeah, you're right. That's on the somewhere on the California coast, I believe, like between San Francisco and L.A., somewhere down there. Have you ever been by the Hearst Castle?
I can't remember exactly where, but yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So, but that's a little George Hearst. He also, at the time of his death in 1891, he was a U.S. Senator from California. So had used his wealth and influence to find his way into high office. So that's George Hearst. His wife was also from the area around Sullivan, Missouri. He'd actually come back from California and to take care of his ailing mother, and while here met and married a young woman who was about half his age, and she was the mother of William Randolph Hearst. Hornskriggle is synonymous with hornswoggle. Some of you have probably heard of hornswoggle. It's more common in today's English. It's not terribly common, but it's more common than hornskriggle or snooker. Snooker's the one that I always heard growing up. You know, if you fool somebody, you snooker somebody, trick them. So that's what that is. And if you remember our Shannon County film that we watched, our example sentence down here is kind of a reflection of that. You remember the gentleman talking about trading knives, swapping knives, and one guy trying to best the other one in these knife swaps and stuff like that. So that's sort of an homage to the Shannon County folks on there. Okay, let's talk a little diversity in the Ozarks. Of course, when we talk about diversity, we could be talking about any number of things. We've talked about physical diversity, the diversity in terrain from one part of the Ozarks to another part. That's one example of Ozarks diversity. That's not what we're talking about tonight, but that's a good example of that. We've talked about religion a couple of weeks ago, and you have religious diversity in the Ozarks. Not what we're talking about tonight, but all kinds of things you could bring up when talking about Ozarks diversity. And diversity is one of the things that, again, reminds us that in many ways the Ozarks isn't terribly unlike the rest of the country. The demographics might be a little different, the percentages here and there, but you do find diversity as you wander across the Ozarks and as you go out on your road trips and you look at these different places. And tonight what we're going to be talking about mainly is racial and ethnic diversity. We've talked a little bit about ethnic diversity already, especially the Germans who came to the fringes of the Ozarks and eventually farther into the Ozarks in pretty large numbers. And we'll put that map back up. We saw that map earlier in the semester when we talked about pre-Civil War German immigration and other kinds of immigration into the Ozarks, and remember some of our towns. One of the things about this map is that several of these immigrant settlements, these places settled by foreign immigrants, were not settled until after the Civil War. And that's mainly what we'll be talking about tonight, is some of the increasing post-Civil War immigration and diversity that you get in the Ozarks. And it's more than just German speakers coming to the Ozarks and to the fringes of the Ozarks. You get German speakers, you get other kinds of people, other kinds of foreign immigrants coming into the region and often settling in places like southwest Missouri, not very far from where we are here. And so we'll talk about some of those communities and how they come about. Now, again, we've already talked about pre-Civil War Germans in the Ozarks and the reasons that they were here, where they settled in the fringes of the Ozarks. We've talked about Native Americans in the early part of the course, and certainly that was a piece of Ozarks diversity that remained in the region and remains with us today because of northeastern Oklahoma's status as Indian territory, and especially as Cherokee territory with other smaller groups there. But after the Civil War, you get new groups of immigrants who had not been into the Ozarks at the time of the Civil War. And these include Poles. They include people like the Swedes, Bohemians, we'll talk about in a minute, Hungarians. Pretty much you name it, and the same sorts of European immigrants who were coming to America in the years after the Civil War at least made their way to the Ozarks in one little colony. They certainly didn't come in such large numbers as they did to some other parts of America, but almost every group was represented in some small way in the Ozarks somewhere. Italians. There were two different groups of Italians who made their way into the Ozarks in the post-Civil War years. The first group are more commonly referred to as the Waldensians or the Waldenses, and they settled near Monette, down southwest of here. And they were from northern Italy, from the Alps in northern Italy. And the reason they're referred to as the Waldensens or Waldensians is because of their religious practices. They were Protestants who they represented a very old dissenting movement against the Catholic Church. And it was a very interesting group, very small group that ended up coming to Missouri. But this same group in the 1850s, before our Civil War, they had left Europe and moved to South America, most of them to Uruguay. After violence erupted there, they went back to Europe briefly and then came back to the United States, came in through New York, and eventually made their way to southwest Missouri. Very circuitous path they took here, but they made their way to southwest Missouri. They bought land from the railroads, and many of them became farmers and settled there in the Monette area. And several of their descendants are still there today. They established their own church, which today is a Presbyterian church. And they were one of two distinct Waldensian colonies in America, or at least in the southern part of the United States, the other one being in North Carolina, I believe. But they're still there today. One of our graduate students is working on a project. Hopefully it will be a master's thesis on the history of this community, a very neat community down there. But the Waldensians were one group. Probably better known is the other group of Italian settlers in the Ozarks. And these are the Italians who established the town of Tontitown in northwest Arkansas. And it's the same group also that established Rosati, Missouri, up in the Rolla, St. James area in the northern part of the Ozarks. But they also have an interesting story. These were Italians who were, many of them were from northern Italy. They were also from central Italy as well. And these were Catholic Italians, as most Italians were and are. And these Italians first left Italy and came to the United States in the 1890s. In 1895, there was a New York banker and industrialist by the name of Austin Corbin. And Corbin owned a big plantation down in the Delta in Arkansas. And he got the idea that he would import Italian immigrants to work on his plantation in Arkansas. And he would divide up the plantation into little farms, basically, and he would let them pay off the farms over a very long period of time. It was going to work out very well for him, probably better for him than it would for them. And so he brought over several hundred Italians. One group came in 1895. They sailed from Italy to New Orleans, came up the Mississippi River, and then to the plantation, which was right there close to the Mississippi. A couple of years later, or just about a year and a half later, another group came from Italy. These, again, were people pulled from all over Italy, mostly from northern Italy. Ended up in the same place, different route. They came through New York and traveled by train to Arkansas. But the Italian immigrants quickly realized that this plantation, Sunnyside Plantation in Arkansas, was not an ideal place to be. It certainly was unlike anything they were used to, mosquito infested. It was flat, and a lot of them were from northern Italy where it was hilly or mountainous. And they had to learn how to grow cotton, and it was just a completely foreign situation for them. And very soon they started looking to go elsewhere. Several of them died from malaria, and it was just a bad situation. Their leader at Sunnyside was an Italian Catholic priest by the name of Pietro Bandini. And Father Bandini, who was a member of the Scalabrini Fathers, this was a group of Italian priests who kind of made it their mission to protect Italian immigrants who came into the United States. And so he was here with these Italian immigrants, and he went out on their behalf and looked for a place where they could relocate to. And he ended up somehow in northwest Arkansas and saw this land that was for sale, not far from Fayetteville, which is where the University of Arkansas is, just outside a little town called Springdale, which is still there today, one of the bigger towns in northwest Arkansas. And they bought a few hundred acres of land, and about 40 of the families from Sunnyside, way down in the delta of Arkansas, followed him to northwest Arkansas, and they established the Tontitown, which was a little Italian enclave there in the middle of the Ozarks in northwest Arkansas. Another group of the Sunnyside Italians eventually ended up by rail in what we know as Rosati, Missouri. And both of those communities had in common that since they were settled by Italians, they got heavy into the production of grapes and wine. And both of them, or at least Tontitown, still has a grape festival. And I think Rosati, or it's probably moved to St. James, has some sort of grape wine related festival up there as well. When you're driving up I-44 to St. Louis, you'll notice there are several vineyards in that area, and a lot of them originated with the Italians who settled there in the early 1900s. But this is still today two of the more, especially Tontitown, which is held on to its Italian heritage more consciously than has Rosati, is still very much a sign of this early diversity in the Ozarks.
Why the name?
Tontitown? Tonti was the name of one of the original explorers who had come to what's now Arkansas in the late 1600s. Henry de Tonti, and he was Italian, so they took the name. He had no connection to this group, but he was probably the first Italian to ever come into the Mississippi River Valley, and so they named the town for him, Tontitown. Yeah.
Springdale is
North of Fayetteville. Yeah.
Where's Tontitown?
Tontitown is just west of Springdale. It's basically, today Springdale has basically grown out and engulfed Tontitown. It's a suburb of Springdale today, and there are lots of subdivisions and stuff like that. And the descendants of the Italians who settled there, the Italians, as we say in the Ozarks, are greatly outnumbered by the newcomers who have moved in to the area today, but they maintain their cultural heritage. Anyone who's interested, there's an excellent book written by a friend of mine named Susan Young. It's called So Big This Little Place, and it's all about the history of Tontitown and the descendants of these Italian settlers and all that kind of stuff. Lots of really neat pictures in there and stuff like that. But Tontitown has done a very good job of consciously maintaining its Italian heritage. There are a couple of really nice Italian restaurants there.
Is that an actual picture of their church? The one up there?
Yeah, I believe it is. It's been 2 or 3 years since I fished that one out of somewhere. It may come out of this book.
That one photo that you showed, yeah, it's got there looks like a big.
Yeah, that is Tontitown. That's the Catholic Church in Tontitown, and I believe that's the schoolhouse on down from it. But it was just a little Italian village there in the Ozarks. And certainly Father Bandini was largely responsible for them being in the Ozarks. But a neat little place. Anybody ever been to Tontitown? All right.
Is it a pretty big wine festival?
I've never been to the. That's what. Butch is.
Is that where you're?
Yeah, let's find out when it is. Right.
As soon as we get home.
Yeah, I have never been to the wine festival. I couldn't even tell you when it is. We should
Are they
look that up.
wine down there?
I don't know that they. I guess they do. It may. There's not a major, winery or whatever you call. I'm not even sure what you call. Is it a winery, where you make wine? Is that what it is?
August 6th through the 10th this year.
Okay, so it's
August 6th through the 10th.
August 6th through the 10th, 2000. You got the Chamber of Commerce of Tontitown.
No, there's a website, TontiTownGrapeFestival.com.
Okay, there you go.
But they call it a grape festival.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's yeah. They still grow some grapes. Welch's had a big grape juice factory there for several years. I'm not sure. I don't know if it's still there, but for several years in the 20th century, there was a big Welch's factory. So there was a local market that connected with outside markets for the grapes. Now, the Tontitown settlers made it from southeast Arkansas to northwest Arkansas, and some of the other Italians at Sunnyside made it by rail up into central Missouri, into the northern Ozarks. And that's how most of the immigrant groups came to the Ozarks after the Civil War. We know that the railroad expanded in the region rapidly after the Civil War. Springfield had rail service by 1870, 5 years after the war ended, and it moved on down into southwest Missouri, and eventually in the 1880s you get the building of the railroad that parallels Highway 60 east of here through the heart of the Ozarks. And one of the things that these railroad companies did was that they very aggressively marketed their new towns and their land. Of course, railroad companies always had land along the right-of-way of the railroad to sell. That's part of the way that they made their money right off the bat, was by selling this land that they were sometimes given. And so these railroad companies, like the Frisco and other railroads, marketed land, and they found that it was often very lucrative to market this land to groups of colonists, to groups of immigrants who would often buy land in chunks and then kind of divide it up amongst themselves, buy hundreds of acres of land at a time. And that's how many of these immigrant communities got into the Ozarks. The railroads would use their national and international marketing capacities to attract these buyers. And so you had all kinds of immigrant communities coming into the region. A couple years ago, I came across this old, it was from an old magazine called The World's Work, and there's an article in it called Railroading Knowledge to the Farmers. And the article is mainly about the railroad having these programs where it taught people how to do different kinds of farming and new kinds of farming. For instance, growing grapes might be one of the things the railroad would have they'd have a car set up especially for training people how to do these new agricultural methods, and it would travel around the country. But in this same article, there's a section where they talk about a group of immigrant communities that were settled by railroad companies in Missouri. And among them are, one of them is Tontitown, Arkansas, which was partly railroad related, not completely. But the rest of them are all in Missouri, and they've got places like an Italian colony in the Marshfield area. You ever heard of that one? I don't know that if there are any remnants of that or not, but apparently there was an Italian colony at or near Marshfield, which is obviously not far from here. Knobview, Missouri. I'm not even sure I know where Knobview is. I know where Knob Noster is, but I'm not sure about Knobview. There's a Pilot Knob, and there's a Knob Lick, but we got lots of knobs and views and stuff like that. We'll talk about this one in a minute. There was a Czech or a Bohemian community in the Bolivar, Missouri area, and that one's listed on here as one of the communities influenced by railroad settlement. Polish community at Bricefield, Missouri. That may be, Bricefield may be Pulaski Fields. Anybody ever heard of Pulaski Field, Missouri? Down in Berry County. It was a Polish settlement after the Civil War, railroad related. And they may have changed the name, or this may be a completely different place. Freistadt. Some of you know where Freistadt is, out west of Springfield. German, even the name there would suggest. And Freistadt, like Taneytown, has held on to its ethnic heritage. Right, they have Oktoberfest, I guess, over there instead of a wine festival. So that one is not too far from here, railroad. French settlement at Dillon, Missouri. Dillon, I'm not sure. I should have got the map out and looked some of these up. I just
How's Dillon?
Dillon. It just hit me about 5 minutes before class that I had this thing I'd found a couple years ago, and I fished it out, and I didn't have time to look up the town. Dillon, Missouri. And then it lists 3 Swedish colonies. Verona, which is over in Lawrence County, west of here. There was a small Swedish colony there. And the one that's pictured up here, Swedenborg, which is up in the northern part of the Ozarks, kind of in the greater Rolla area. It's not too far off of I-44 in the greater Rolla area up there. And then one at a place called Brady, Missouri. And again, I'm not even sure where that is. But these were just a sampling of dozens of these little immigrant communities. Did you ever find Dillon?
Yeah, Dillon's in between Rolla and St. James, just off of I-44.
Okay, so it's in the same general area up there that Swedenborg and
Railroad ran all along.
Yeah, right. And that's why, you rarely, that's for instance why you didn't find these kinds of immigrant communities, say, in Douglas County or Ozark County. There were no railroads there. Now, Douglas County did have a railroad for a time that ran down to Ava. But for instance, Ozark County, no railroad down there. And over in the eastern counties, lots of that area was not served by railroad. Or if it was by, logging trams, those kinds of railroads that were owned by logging companies. And that's one reason in the more remote areas of the Ozarks, and especially down in the Arkansas Ozarks, which had fewer railroads, and there were lots bigger splotches of land where you didn't have railroad access, you didn't have as many of these immigrant communities settled down there. They rarely got very far from the railroads. So that was a big key to these things. And later we'll watch a film, we'll probably watch a film on the survival of some French heritage in the eastern Ozarks. Though there's a neat film that Ozarks Watch Video magazine did on where they interviewed a couple of descendants of the Bohemian colony near Bolivar. And these were 2 elderly people. I think they were a brother and sister who actually grew up speaking Czech and reading the Bible in their native tongue and all that kind of stuff, even though they were born here in Missouri and raised in the Ozarks. Okay, we'll switch gears and talk about some racial diversity in the Ozarks. And I don't think we've talked a lot about slavery in here this semester, but certainly Missouri and Arkansas were slave states before the Civil War, and slavery was spread across the Ozarks. There were some areas of the Ozarks where you had slaves in pretty significant numbers, and other areas of the Ozarks where you didn't have slaves at all for large sections of land. Now this figure, in 1860, the year before the Civil War starts, this figure of 29,000 slaves in the Ozarks is a very rough figure, and what I did to arrive at that number is I took pretty much all of the Ozarks counties. Remember back the first week or two of the semester when we did our Ozarks map, and we had all those counties and we had the border around the Ozarks. Pretty much if the county appeared on that map, I counted it. So that means that a lot of these counties are border Ozarks counties, and a lot of the counties where the heaviest slave concentrations were along the Missouri River, along the Arkansas River, on the borders of the region, and they were more, river valley counties than they were real Ozarks counties. So that number is really inflated, but still there were thousands of slaves in the Ozarks at the time of the Civil War, no matter how you do the math. If you take the number there, that was over 6% of the population. And I would say probably a more accurate number would be somewhere around 4 or 5% of the Ozarks population would have been composed of slaves. So small compared to most of the South, most of the slaveholding states, that's a small percentage, but more significant than you might think in a place like the Ozarks, which for much of the 20th century and into the 21st century had the reputation of being a sort of lily-white area where there were very, very few blacks. There was a larger percentage of the black population in the Ozarks in those days than there is today. Now, as I mentioned, lots of counties had very few, if any, slaves, and some of them had quite a few. There were, as you can see there, in 21 counties in the Ozarks, slaves made up less than 1% of the population, so slavery was almost non-existent in 21 counties. There was one county in the Ozarks that did not have a single slave at the time of the Civil War. Anybody want to guess what it was?
No, I said where, but.
Okay. We'll find out. One county had no slave. No, it was Douglas County. Yeah, that's what. Douglas County did not have a slave, or at least at the time of the 1860 census, a year before the Civil War broke out, there were no slaves in Douglas County, and there were several other counties where, you might have a dozen, or fewer than 50 slaves altogether. But Douglas was the one county. I don't know if it was the only county in Missouri without a slave, but it was certainly the only county in the Ozarks. It's that there's no sort of industry, no extractive industry in Douglas County, and there's also no plantation agriculture in Douglas County. Douglas County, like many of the Ozark counties, is rugged. There's very little flat land down there. About the only really fertile agricultural land you would have is in a river or creek bottom somewhere, and that's even pretty narrow in Douglas County, in Ozark County, and Wright County, and a lot of places like that. But you'd think that there would have been a slave owner somewhere passing through Douglas County, as plentiful as slaves were in Arkansas and Missouri at that time, but it was the one county that didn't. And as Sierra mentioned, the counties like St. Francis and Washington, these were both mining counties. We've already talked about the lead industry, and a lot of the manual labor used in lead mining, going all the way back to the days of Moses Austin and even to the French before Moses Austin got here, was done by slaves. So that probably accounted for a pretty significant proportion of the slaves in that area. And other places like Cole County, Cooper County, these are Missouri River Valley counties, and it's probably a little, Cooper County, you can see almost 22% slave in 1860. Not a place that most of us would consider part of the Ozarks today, and they certainly wouldn't consider themselves part of the Ozarks in Cooper County or Cole County for that matter. But Greene County is on the list. Over 10% of the population of Greene County here in Springfield was slave, and some of those would have been industrial type slaves working in the milling industry as blacksmiths or other things around Springfield. Some of them would have been agricultural slaves. There would have been a diversity of uses for slaves in those days, and some of the slaves were skilled workers. And it was very common in the Ozarks for slave owners to rent their slaves out and to receive pay from an industrialist or a farmer or something like that for use of a slave. Mainly because it's on the river, it's fertile river valley land up there, and that's really more in the kind of an extension of the Little Dixie area of central Missouri where you have plantation agriculture. You would have had several plantations in Cooper County that you wouldn't see necessarily in the Ozarks. There were some plantations in the Ozarks, but they were few and far between compared to most other places in the South.
That 10% in Greene County surprises me.
Mm-hmm.
How did they get here? Were they, in the South, there were slave auctions and things
Right.
like that.
Yeah, Millie asks how the slaves got here, specifically the 10% plus in Greene County. Most of them were brought with the settlers, early settlers. Many of the early settlers to the Ozarks, very few of them had large numbers of slaves, but it was very common for the settlers to own a slave or two, maybe a slave family, and to bring them with them. That's how most of them got here, yeah.
What happened after the Civil War when the slaves were supposedly freed
Right.
to that 10% here?
Right. What happened to the 10% after the Civil War? It actually, in Greene County, it increases. And in Springfield, it increases. The black population grew significantly after the Civil War in the late 1800s up until an event that we'll talk about in a minute that kind of puts a halt to that and even causes it to slow down. Springfield became a kind of a magnet for freed blacks in the Ozarks, southwest Missouri, northwest Arkansas, because there was a sizable black community in Springfield. It attracted others to come here. They had their own businesses, their own business section and professionals and things like that. And it was really a unique case in the Ozarks where you had a critical mass of black people to have that kind of little enclave in Springfield that you didn't get in other smaller towns in the Ozarks.
Was that in North Springfield?
I don't, my guess is I really don't know enough details about the black community in Springfield to know. I'm guessing there wasn't just one community where they lived. The population would have been large enough where they could have been scattered around Springfield. But I really don't know the details of Springfield's black community. There are some good sources for that. The Springfield Greene County Library has some online documents relating to the history of the black community here in Springfield and in Greene County in general. And there were smaller rural black communities here in Greene County that were not in Springfield, farming communities at the old community they called No-Go out northeast of Springfield, out sort of south of I-44, northeast of Springfield. That was a black community, and there was one out around in the Willard area. Cave Spring was the name of that one. And there was another one out sort of due east of Springfield, Danforth, the Danforth Church community out there. So there were several of those communities. And in neighboring counties as well. One of the better known rural black communities in southwest Missouri and the Missouri Ozarks was over in the Hartville area in Wright County. And that community held on for several years. And certainly in Arkansas you had similar situations. Fayetteville, which is in Washington County, Arkansas, became sort of northwest Arkansas's center, at least for a small black community. There was a pretty vibrant black community there, and there were lots of rural black settlements as well in the Arkansas Ozarks, usually very small ones. All right, one of the reasons that the 20th century would produce an Ozarks or an Ozarks reputation that often went hand in hand with lily whiteness was a series of race-related violent events that occurred in the late 1800s and early 1900s that resulted in many blacks leaving the Ozarks region altogether. And of course, Springfield has what has become the most well-documented of these events, but it wasn't the first and wasn't the last of these. And there were several other examples of white on black violence that escalated beyond just minor little affairs that sometimes resulted in entire communities of African Americans being driven out of their towns. One of the first of those would happen in Monette, Missouri in 1894 when a mob hanged a young black man who was suspected of having killed a white railroad worker. And then 7 years later in Pierce City, not far from Monette, you get a highly publicized event, a race-related event, where a mob hangs Will Godley. There was a young white woman of German descent there, of a German family, who had been murdered, and people suspected Godley of being the murderer, and he was hung from the balcony of the Lawrence Hotel in Pierce City, a railroad town. And in this case, you can see that a mob, after the hanging, rampaged through the small black section of Pierce City and pretty much burned it to the ground. And the blacks of Pierce City escaped, and most of them never came back. And Pierce City, in recent years, has tried to some degree come to grips with its past, and they've been a little more open about this event that happened over 100 years ago, but we'll talk more about that later. And then 2 years after the Pierce City affair in Joplin, you had a similar incident where another young black man was hanged, was suspected of killing a police officer, and was captured and hanged. And again, an angry mob of whites rampaged through the black part of town and burned several homes and ran people off. And but these things are they're a mark on the history of the Ozarks, but they're actually a mark on the history of the Ozarks that again reminds us that the Ozarks was very much part of the American scene in that day, because in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was a sort of epidemic of these sorts of race-related events that happened around the United States. And the Ozarks was part of that. We had a smaller population than a lot of places here, but the way that these events took place and the violence that occurred, in addition to lynchings where entire black communities were tormented and sometimes run off, was a story that played out over and over in American history in those days. And a lot of it had to do didn't have to do with the railroads per se, but a lot of the violence was generated by the rapid change going on in the late 1800s. Historians who've studied this phenomena say that a lot of this has to do with quick modernization. You get these railroad towns, and you get people who are new to these places. You get young black men coming in and out of town, and no one knows who they are. And you mix all that together with a good dose of racism and paranoia and all that kind of stuff. And these incidents happen. They often happen around after the murder of a white person, or after the assault on a white woman, which was a very common theme for many of these things. And so the Ozarks is not terribly unlike the American story from this era. Yeah. Butch brings up a good point, which is using the example of Gainesville, Texas. I'm not familiar with that story, but as you say, this is something that happened all over the United States, and unfortunately, it's not a unique story for us, and it's the kind of thing that lots of places, whether it's Gainesville, Texas, or Pierce City, Missouri, or Harrison, Arkansas, are dealing with still today. The memory of these things. How do you come to terms with this? In some cases, as in Pierce City, you have the descendants of black people who lost their homes, who sometimes lost their land over this, coming back and challenging. I'm not sure what the end result of any of this is, but it's still very much can be a hot button issue depending on how local cities and areas decide to handle it. Yeah. Of course, the most famous of Southwest Missouri's race-related violent episodes was the so-called Easter offering, as some of the papers referred to it back in those days. The 1906 Triple Lynching that took place in downtown Springfield, which was spurred again by the supposed or alleged assault of a young white woman, and two of her alleged attackers were taken out of the jail by a mob and hanged, and then one other guy who just happened to be in the jail for an unrelated arrest was also taken out and hanged. He was in there for allegedly killing a Civil War veteran. This is obviously the one that gets this got loads of national press, and the fact that it kind of fit into this epidemic of race-related lynchings makes it, and it comes on the heels of these other recent lynchings that sort of just make their way, connect the dots around the region. Kimberly Harper, White Man's Heaven. A very good book that has a few chapters on the Springfield. She actually treats all of these events. She doesn't deal with the earlier, she's looking at the 1890s and early 1900s here as part of this national epidemic of race violence. But she looks at all these, and anyone interested, I would encourage you to take a look at White Man's Heaven for, a good example of kind of tying this, the Ozarks story into a broader national context with these. Millie mentions both the gruesome nature of this lynching. Not that any lynching is not going to be gruesome, but certainly the burning, and then it was common for people to claim souvenirs, whether they were burned parts of a body or parts of a rope or something like that. That was actually a pretty common thing for people to come away or want to come away from these things with souvenirs. As far as the burial of the three young men, I'm not sure why two were buried together and the other separate. For one thing, it just tells you that...
Well, it could have been affluence. That guy looks like he had some money.
It could have been.
They could have had money. They could have paid to bury him. And
Yeah.
Not,
Well, it reminds you that certainly just because they were three young black men in Springfield doesn't mean they had any connection. Now Duncan and Coker worked together, and they actually knew each other. They worked at the same stable, and they were later Duncan and Coker were later absolved of any
The woman
wrongdoing.
apparently wasn't even assaulted.
Right. From what I remember from the book is that it was very unusual that there was basically a jury trial after the fact, after their death, and the jury said, there's no evidence that they did anything, and we're pretty sure that nothing was done. So it was again one of those cases where you have heightened tension caused by race and all the paranoia that goes along with that, and the fact that it's this era when this is happening. There are lots of factors that go into this. A lot of Springfield's African Americans left. Many of them came back. It wasn't a case like Pierce City where they left and never came back. And a lot of that was because there were lots of blacks in Springfield at that time, and it was a sizable enough community where even an event like this wouldn't, just totally destroy the community. And certainly, I'm sure that the memory of Springfield kept lots of other blacks in the region from continuing to come to Springfield as a magnet place, and caused a lot to leave and never come back. But the community didn't completely disappear like it did in some of these other places.
What's the percentage of blacks in Springfield?
Today, I'm not sure it's not very,
6%.
it may be, and the Greene County figures are, I think, around 3%. Of course, almost all the African Americans in Greene County live in Springfield, but it's a really small percentage, much smaller than it was at this time, when at one time in the late 1800s, I believe, Springfield was something like 15 to 20% black, and it's certainly nowhere near that today. And then the last instance we have is one that took place or actually two events that took place down in the same town in Arkansas, Harrison, Arkansas. Again, Harrison was a new railroad town in the early 1900s. Had a small black community of probably a little over 100 people there in the early 1900s. And once, first in 1905 and then later in 1909, you have these episodes of violence. And finally, the first one has an episode of mob rampaging that doesn't scatter the black community, doesn't completely destroy the small black part of town in Harrison. But the second one does, the 1909 event after a black man is convicted of raping an elderly white woman does result in an episode of mob violence that pretty much purges the town of African Americans there. After that 1909 event, by 1910, there's only one elderly black woman left in Harrison. So over 100 black people had been scared out of town and didn't come back after this event. So again, it was the last really high profile of these race-related episodes of violence, but one that had lasting effects.
How did they do cocaine? Did they smoke it back then?
I'm not sure. The question is how did you do cocaine in the early 1900s? I guess maybe like you do now. I don't. I'm not much of an expert on drugs or drug history. I don't know. That I don't know.
Probably drink it. Got a Coca-Cola.
Oh yeah, they could have got a little bit of it in soft drinks in those days, but injected it. That may I really don't know. I've never had anybody ask that question. Really?
Cocaine was about the only
That's why Coke is
illegal
called Coke.
drug
Yeah.
back then.
Cocoa.
Morphine.
Yeah. There was lots of in the late 1800s there were thousands of morphine addicts in the United States and other kinds of morphine like whatever the term is, the drugs like that, and doctors freely prescribed that stuff and people got addicted to it all the time. Some of this stuff you could get through mail order, patent medicines, that sort of stuff, and or you could buy it from doctors, and that's there were lots of addicts. Just the other day I was reading an account of it was an oral history of a woman who grew up in the Ozarks in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and she was naming all of the relatives she had who were addicted to morphine or some other drug she named that I'd never heard of. It was kind of like morphine. So it's something we don't think much about. Today we have meth culture and different things, but it's been with us. And a lot of these the ones she's naming are older people, people who had illnesses and had gotten addicted to morphine or some kind of pain reliever a while, and sometimes would remain addicts the rest of their lives. Lives that may be shortened, because of that. Yeah. So, very, again, things we don't often associate with the good old days, right? Though I do remember from when I was a kid, there was one of the very special episodes of A Little House on the Prairie dealt with morphine addiction. Anybody remember that one? When Charles gets not Charles, that's the dad. Albert, the adopted son, gets addicted to morphine or something. I believe it's been 30 years or more since I've seen that, but I remember even as a kid thinking, that's weird, And here they are riding horses and buggies and stuff, and you got a dope head back 100 years ago. Things haven't changed all that much except the mode of transportation. Let's see what else we've got here. Just here are a couple things. This is a proclamation issued by the city of Pierce City back in 2005, talking about, here it says, whereas the exodus of nearly 300 African Americans from Pierce City, and it's basically kind of a city apology for what happened back, over 100 years ago in Pierce City. And this is a letter from 2005 that was issued by the city of Pierce City in 2005. And it was actually a proclamation, June 3rd, 2005, signed by the mayor, Mark Peters. And but it's basically just talking about what happened in 1901 in Pierce City. And this is, again, the Ozarks, increasingly in the 20th century, earned this reputation as a kind of lily-white region, as a place where you rarely would see black people. And in some instances, that was used as marketing. And this is kind of a booster flyer, broadside for the city of Siloam Springs, Arkansas, which is in extreme northwest Arkansas, right on the Oklahoma border. And you can read through all of the different ways that they're promoting the city, and you come down to here, it says, no malaria, no mosquitoes, no Negroes. That's part of the, that's part of the appeal of Siloam Springs. And this is from the early 1900s. So, and, there are all kinds of anecdotal stories as recently as probably the 70s and 80s and maybe the 2000s of realtors, using that as a selling point for attracting people to the Ozarks.
There's
Yeah.
a book out called Sundown Towns.
Sundown Towns,
Yeah, and
Jim Lowen.
Yeah, I found out that I grew up in a sundown town I didn't know.
Yeah.
It was south of Detroit.
All over the United States.
All over, it was astonishing. I think when he started to write the book, he thought he'd find a few.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
Yeah. Yeah, and several of Jim Lowen's sundown towns are in the Ozarks, but they are just all over the place. And a lot of these towns are places that sometimes had official ordinances that prohibited black people from living in these towns.
Make
Yeah.
it work.
Yeah.
They had to leave from the summit now. So what towns around here are sundown towns?
Well, some of the ones that he identifies are some of the ones where the racial episodes happen, like Harrison, Arkansas, which becomes, I don't think there was ever a law there prohibiting black people from living there, but because of the history of Harrison, it becomes a sundown town de facto. And I would say that it's largely because of that history at Harrison that Harrison later in the late 20th century attracts the kinds of people, kind of militant, racist, Aryan Brotherhood, KKK type groups. Yeah, and they're in that area. There are at least a couple of groups that are white supremacist sort of groups down there, and I'm sure that has something to do. At the time they moved in, there were no black people there, and there was also that kind of history, that sundown town sort of history of the area. We had talked about how the black community in Springfield survived in smaller numbers, but because of the size of it before the 1906 event, it survived. That wasn't always the case in Harrison, Arkansas. You had the complete, erasure of the black community, with the exception of one elderly woman who stayed in the town until she died a few years later. You had in Lawrence County, which is where Monette and Pierce City are located, you had a sizable decrease in the black population between 1890 and 1920 from 364 to 81. In Berry County, the south part of Monette, I believe, is in Berry County. You had basically the black population of Berry County disappears, and in Harrison, Arkansas, you can see there from 115 to 1, and only in recent years have a few black people moved back into the Harrison area. So this is something that lasts for the better part of 100 years, the expulsion of the black community there. But we could look at other instances too where the black population of counties decreased pretty significantly in the years surrounding the late 19th and early 20th centuries when all this kind of stuff was happening in the Ozarks and elsewhere across the United States.